Hello, welcome back to Risk Management. Today's talk is entitled Financial Risk Part 6, The Risk of Fiat Money. We're continuing our discussion of fiat money from the last class, and ultimately why we're talking about this is there are two deterministic causes of volatility in the market that I want to focus on in this course. Of course, there's an infinite number of things we could look at. I'm picking two that I think have had overbearing, dominant effects on increasing volatility in the market as a result of certain specific monetary and fiscal interventions by the US government. I think these things are going to become increasingly important in recent years and in coming years. And as a result, it's important to discuss these issues as things you should be aware of as risk managers in the marketplace when you're trying to advise your clients about how to manage macroeconomic financial risk. So we talked in the last class a little bit about counterfeiting and how counterfeiting can lead to inflation. I also suggested that government fiat money, money that is printed not based on any sort of specific wealth, but simply out of paper, out of thin air, can have similar effects on the economy of causing inflation as can counterfeited money by people doing so illegally, even though fiat money, as you will see, is in fact legal under US law. So to talk about this, we need to first understand what is a dollar. Because if we don't understand actual value and what something is worth, then it's hard to have any concept of why fiat money is valueless. To start this conversation, I wanted to go back to the definition of what a dollar was in the early days of the American Republic. A dollar, by definition, was 1/20th of an ounce of 24-karat gold, or 20 ounces, $20 is 1 ounce of gold. Here, for example, is a dollar gold coin, 1/20th of an ounce of gold from 1853 for the US Republic. It always seemed clear from the early days of the US Constitution that money was to be weighed in precious metals. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5 of the US Constitution gives Congress the power to coin money, interestingly enough, and to regulate the value thereof. Notice also I've put in brackets here alloy and value thereof. Alloy meaning the metallic caliber or quantity or carat of the money. And so therefore one can coin money and one can also regulate the alloy thereof. This phrase was actually not found in the Constitution, but it was found in the notes of the Constitutional Convention as something the founders had proposed be part of the Constitution. They ultimately left it out of the document. But the idea at the time of the constitutional creation was one that money had value because it was a precious metal. And ultimately, therefore, it was not subject to counterfeiting easily or to inflationary pressures. One of the things, though, that came about very rapidly, even before the Constitution was created, was a temptation to print paper money in order to serve as a proxy for real money, being gold or silver. And even in this Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress printed these things called Continentals, which were paper money that promised the bearer that they could redeem that piece of paper for real gold or silver in the proper weight after turning over this IOU slip. It was effectively a claim check. And so here, for example, you see that it says $3 where the bill and bearer is entitled to receive 3 Spanish milled dollars in gold or silver's value according to this piece of paper. There's an old saying, not worth a continental, because these paper pieces ultimately devalued very quickly and the government couldn't honor its pledge to pay in gold or silver. Lots of banks actually ended up doing very similar things to this throughout history. Even in the early days of the American Republic, there was a central bank, the US Bank, and that bank would issue paper currency and scrip like this, promising that people could redeem the piece of paper in gold or silver for holding this piece of paper. And indeed, various banks, private banks, did so as well. Here's the Union Bank of New York promising $1 in gold or silver in redemption for this piece of paper. Other banks did the same. Miners and Planters Bank, the Rhode Island Bank, the Sanford Bank, each promising a bearer of this piece of paper a certain amount of gold or silver in exchange for it. Now, one of the things that's important to keep in mind when we're talking about this in banking is that there's actually two forms of banking. One form of banking is loan banking, where I give money to the bank and the bank turns around and loans that money out to somebody else in exchange for some sort of interest payment to me for giving them that money. Traditionally, that used to be what was called loan banking. Today, you might recognize it as CDs, certificates of deposit, where you leave your money with the bank for a certain period of time, and there's a penalty if you take it out early because the bank is loaning your money out and therefore pays you a higher interest rate for that privilege. There's also a different form of banking called deposit banking. This is nowadays most recognizable in terms of a safe deposit box at the bank that you can rent. But in the old days, it used to be that banks were safekeeping for gold and silver that people possessed, better than to hide it under your mattress. At least so the thinking went. And so you put it in the bank, and then for that you got a claim check, a note, a debt instrument that said the bank has your gold and silver, and it looked very much like these notes here that I'm showing you on this screen. And in exchange for that note, you could come back at any time, hand the note over, and receive the amount of gold or silver that the note promised you. It wasn't necessarily your gold or silver, but it was equivalent quality and equivalent weight to what you had originally deposited at the bank. And this allowed you to walk around without having to carry heavy gold or silver in your pockets all the time to do business. Your notes that you had for the Miners and Planters Bank might end up at the Rhode Island area, and you might say in Rhode Island, rather than pay you in gold and silver, will you accept this note to this bank where I left gold and silver before? And if the person recognized that the bank was legitimate, they might accept your paper currency from that private bank rather than actual physical gold or silver payment, because they could always go back and get the gold and silver themselves. Now, here's the problem. Once this practice starts, entrepreneurial bankers might get a little bit shady. And what they could do is they could say the following. We know that Chris Gazelian is not going to come back for his gold until at least a month or two from now. What if we could do a little bit of side business on his gold and silver? What if we made a loan out of it, even though we're not supposed to because it's on deposit for him to pick up whenever he wants? And so we are going to loan this out by creating a second counterfeit piece of paper as a second note against the same money on reserve. So Gazelian got one note from our bank saying you can come get $5 in gold or silver whenever you want, but we'll write a second slip against the exact same gold and silver and hope that they don't come back at the same time. And that way we can do a little bit of side business. This is called, in modern terms, fractional reserve banking, a very fancy phrase to basically say the banks are only keeping a fraction of the reserves of what they've actually pledged to people is on reserve in their banks. And so this is, in effect, a form of Ponzi scheme, and yet has become legal. In Foley versus Hill and others in 1848, here's what Lord Cottenham of the House of Lords in Britain said about money being placed in the hands of bankers. He said, if you place money in the custody of a banker, to all intents and purposes, that money is now the money of the banker, to do with as the banker pleases. The banker is guilty of no breach of trust in employing the money for loans. He is not answerable to the principal if he puts it in jeopardy, if the banker engages in a hazardous speculation. The banker is not bound to keep it or deal with the money as the property of the principal, but he is, of course, answerable for the amount because he is contracted. Wow, is that talking out of both sides of your mouth at the same time or what? On the one hand, I can engage in hazardous speculation with your money the minute you leave it at the bank. I can loan it out to other people, do whatever I want with it. If this were my Ferrari and I were leaving it in a warehouse, can you imagine if they let me loan this, if the warehouse owner loaned this Ferrari out for fun to a relative and said, well, you weren't coming back for 2 weeks, so I can do with your Ferrari whatever I want? Of course not. But bankers are allowed under law, since Foley versus Hill, and in the United States similar laws have been replicated, allowing for bankers to use money however they wish, even if you were supposed to be keeping it safe for the depositor. And so for this reason, banks would always engage in hazardous speculation with money. They were, of course, supposed to be answering for this money if in fact it was lent out speculatively, but that's always an after-the-fact question. Sorry, I don't have your money anymore. Where did it go? I engaged in hazardous speculation. Well, I'd like it back. Sorry, I don't have it. Talk to the FDIC. The government may guarantee you money. In any event, one of the things that came out of this that should be of note to you is that lots of private banks started to engage in such speculation. And of course, the problem is if you start issuing lots of notes against money that is on deposit in your bank, well, those notes end up ultimately in the hands of other bankers because somebody takes that note to another bank to pay a debt they have there. And so other banks are not going to just hold these pieces of paper in perpetuity. They want to hold physical gold or silver. So they would come back to your private bank. And when they came back to your private bank, they would demand payment in gold and silver. Now, if you had pushed out a whole lot of paper copies of these little notes trying to run a Ponzi scheme, eventually all the banks were going to come calling and your gold and silver in your bank was going to dissipate overnight and you would be out of business. This was sort of a check or a hedge against banks cheating like this because they would ultimately go out of business if they did such practices. Didn't stop a lot of banks from doing it, but ultimately they usually went poof. Now, one of the ways you could get around this is what if you had a central bank, a bank where everyone moved their money into that bank and the bank itself issued money for everyone. And so there was one paper currency, not for one private bank, but for all the private banks. And no bank was allowed to raid the other bank's actual gold and silver coffers. That sort of bank would be immune from the problem of going poof because it would control the entire money supply and wouldn't let banks raid each other. Of course, all banks would benefit from this because all banks would, in effect, be loaning out additional paper money well beyond the amount that they had on reserve in gold and silver. It's a coordinated cartel that allows for inflationary practice of making loans with money that you don't actually have. One thing that you might think about when you think about what bankers do is this comes borderline up to what might be called embezzlement. Somebody comes into possession of personal property of another in a lawful manner. In other words, I'm a banker and I receive your gold and silver. And then I perform some act that demonstrates my intent to deprive another person of the property. Now here's the key word, permanently. Because I might intend to deprive you of the property at least for a while without telling you that I'm going to loan your money out. But as long as I say I didn't intend to do it permanently, then I escape the traditional definition of embezzlement. But what bankers were allowed to do after Foley versus Hill was borderline embezzlement that for any other industry would be considered criminal. Indeed, central banks have existed throughout history, and there have been no shortage of attempts to create them in the United States. Back in Philadelphia in 1791, with the push of Alexander Hamilton and others in government, there was created a 20-year charter of a national bank. Here is the picture of the building, which you can still go see in Philadelphia. There was a second bank charter, and of course, when you have a second bank charter, you need a whole new building. The first building doesn't work. So they built a second building in Philadelphia, and it lasted, again, likewise 20 years. And then for a while, the bankers couldn't get their acts together because they were sort of busted up by Andrew Jackson and others who felt that paper money created by a central government was dangerous for society for the exact reason that we talked about in the last lecture, that it effectively amounts to a form of legal counterfeiting by printing money against which there's no basis in gold or silver to justify. And so there was a period of time when no bank was created. However, in Britain in 1844, the government gave the Bank of England fiat power, the ability to print however much paper money it wanted that would serve as the currency for England. And the US didn't follow far behind. Within a half century, the Federal Reserve Bank, the current central bank of the United States, starting in 1913, was authorized under an act of Congress and issued paper money. Now, what's interesting about the paper money that they issued was originally this was gold-backed money, $35 an ounce, you'll notice here. And if you look in the upper left corner of this dollar bill, it says it's redeemable in gold on demand at the Treasury or at the central bank. And so you could bring in this piece of paper currency and still get gold for your money. Of course, they were printing more of these bills than there was actually gold on reserve. And notice something else about this. What we originally had said at the beginning of this lecture was that by definition, a dollar was a 20th of an ounce of gold, or $20 was 1 ounce of gold. Look at the price that the government's offering here, $35 for an ounce of gold. What's happened? Inflation. The government has, in fact, printed more money than they actually had gold to back it, and therefore you now have almost a doubling a halving of the value of the money and paper currency that it had before. In other words, I can only get about half as much gold for my money now under his 1928 paper currency as I could have before when it was $20 for an ounce of gold. And then after a while, it degraded even further to the point that we got silver-backed dollars rather than gold-backed dollars. Here's a silver certificate paper $1 bill that guarantees that I can get silver to the bearer on demand. We've tarnished ourselves a little bit. We're not on gold standard anymore. We're on a silver standard. And then ultimately, Nixon took us off the gold standard entirely in 1973. And since then, we get this, which is what is always in your pocket whenever you have this in your pocket, a piece of paper that is backed only by the full faith and credit of the US government, but for which you cannot redeem it to get gold or silver. And in other words, the government sets how much of this is in supply, just as we remember in the last class when the Archangel Gabriel could sprinkle additional money into society. The government, so too here, can sprinkle additional money into society in whatever amount it wants. Just as in that scenario before, we saw that if the Archangel Gabriel didn't sprinkle the money equally, it would cause inflation in society, as certain people got the money first, spent it, drove up prices, and other people who didn't get access to that money until later ultimately suffered because they couldn't even buy as much as they used to. So fiat currency ended up creating what we might call a regressive tax. It favors the wealthy, those who can get the money from the government first, such as banks, and ultimately penalizes those who get the money last, people on fixed income pensions such as Social Security holders or others of that sort. For that reason, I'm going to skip through this slide here. These are just a few of the different types of things the government has done to shore up its support to say that this currency is legal and that paper currency and fiat money is the only currency that you can use in the United States. If you're interested in these, you can write me about them and I can tell you about some of the US Supreme Court cases that you can read through here that made sure that only paper money issued by the US government would serve as legal tender and only US government paper money would be fiat money. There's some very powerful quotes I'll leave you with for what this will do to our economy, and you will see ultimately that a lot of the inflation that has gone on in our economy is due in no shortage to fiat money's production since 1973 and even earlier since 1913. Here's Mayor Anselm Rothschild of the Rothschild banking family who says, "Give me control of the nation's money and I don't care who makes its laws." Or George Washington, writing on this, says that paper money will operate in the body of politics like liquor on the human body. It preys on the vitals and ultimately destroys the body. Paper money has the effect in your state it will ever have to ruin commerce, oppress the honest, and open the door to every species of fraud and injustice. Paper money, and according to Andrew Jackson, president in 1836, said that mischief springs from the power which the moneyed interest derives from a paper currency which they are able to control, from the multitude of corporations with exclusive privileges and access to that money, which are employed altogether for their benefit. Thomas Jefferson, writing on this, says that I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. Already they have raised up a moneyed aristocracy with access to this paper money that has set the government at defiance. The issuing power of money should be taken away from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs. Thomas Jefferson, writing again, talking about a national bank, says if the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, as they have with fiat money, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all their property until their children will wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. James Madison, president, writes, history records that the money changers have used every form of abuse, intrigue, deceit, and violent means possible to maintain their control over governments by controlling money and its issuance. Andrew Jackson, writing again, the bold efforts of the present central bank have made to control the government are but premonitions of the fate that await the American people should they be deluded into a perpetuation of this institution or the establishment of another like it. And maybe in closing, we can go with what Henry Ford, the great automaker, once said. It's well that the people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system, for if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning. In other words, fiat money has effects of increasing volatility in the economy. It impoverishes people, creates the need for credit and welfare, and ultimately destabilizes and increases financial risk in the sectors of the American economy. And that is something we will turn to in the next class when we start to look at the questions of free trade zones coupled with fiat money and what that has done to create financialization in our economy and ultimately a weakening of the American consumer and citizen. I look forward to seeing you in the next class, and I'll leave off by saying the following. If you think that inflation doesn't exist because the CPI index is low, here's some goods that I calculated just over 3 years since the Great Recession started, and the increases in goods not computed in the consumer price index and the inflation levels of them. You can see how dramatically inflation has struck the US economy even in a short few years after the Great Recession hit. Okay, that's enough for today. The take-home point: counterfeiting increases inflation in society, and legal fiat money is a form of legal counterfeiting that likewise penalizes Americans, causes a regressive tax, and destabilizes the economy, leading to potential bank failure and also to economic failure on a widespread basis. Look forward to seeing you in the next class.